Hi, this is Professor Melissa Hall, and this is a tutorial on how to write a basic visual analysis essay. Begin by labeling your work with the information provided on the museum label. That includes the artist's name, the title, which should be underlined or italicized like book titles, the date, medium, and museum collection that it belongs to, and a URL to the museum object page. Next, begin to describe the subject matter of the work, and use what you learn from the Skill of Describing tutorial to compose an engaging and vivid description. Here's a first draft. This painting represents the Virgin Mary with the Christ child on her lap. Mary is dressed in a blue robe and seated on a throne. The Christ child is seated on her lap and gestures towards her. This is actually a pretty boring description. It's simply a list of items in the picture. Avoid the laundry list approach to describing. Choose adjectives that express the personality of the picture. So here's a second draft that's more descriptive, that's trying to show rather than simply tell. This painting represents the Virgin Mary with the Christ child on her lap. Mary is elegant and slender, dressed in a blue robe that shimmers with golden highlights, echoing the gold background that symbolized the glittering perfection of heaven in Byzantine art. To emphasize her queenly status, Mary is seated on an elaborately carved throne, with her feet resting on a rectangular footrest. Her long, slender fingers cradle the Christ child as she gestures towards him as the one who leads the way. The expression on her face seems melancholy, as if to suggest her awareness of the fate that awaits him. Now this description has a thesis or opinion. It is showing us that Mary appears queenly and that she seems sad. Now let's analyze the stylistic characteristics of the picture. What works that we've studied in class is it similar to? Well, Sally's student says, well, I think it looks Byzantine, but there are some parts that seem to belong to the Proto-Renaissance. Good. Make that your thesis. So here's a thesis. This painting exemplifies many of the characteristics of the Italo-Byzantine style, but it also has elements typical of the Proto-Renaissance. Good. Now you want to support your thesis by describing specific details. So let's start with what makes this work typical of the Italo-Byzantine style. Well, the Italo-Byzantine characteristics include the gold background, which flattens the space and makes it seem like the figures are floating in heaven. The perspective of the throne and footstool are also off. The diagonal lines don't converge, and therefore they don't successfully create an illusion of depth. There's also very little modeling with light and shade. The Virgin's robes are defined by sharp linear patterns rather than modeling. And the Virgin's face looks like a typical Byzantine icon with her long, thin nose, almond-shaped eyes, and tiny mouth. She doesn't look like a real person, but instead, she appears to follow a one-size-fits-all generic formula. The proportions of the figure are also very unrealistic. All of this was common in Byzantine art. The figures were tall, slender, and elongated. We can see this especially well in the Virgin's impossibly long fingers. But there are also elements of the work that make it typical of the new style of the Proto-Renaissance. In fact, it has a lot in common with the work by Cimabue that we studied in class. For example, the diagonal lines of the throne actually do create a rudimentary sense of depth, even if it isn't completely convincing. Like the throne in Cimabue's Trinidad Madonna, the artist is clearly at least trying to create an illusion of depth and to convince us that Mary is actually sitting in the throne rather than hovering in front of it. The Virgin's knees also project outward from the picture rather than being flattened out as they are in Byzantine icons. This makes her seem more three-dimensional and physically real. The Christ child's body also has some dimension to it. The linear patterns follow the contours of his limbs, so we get a feeling for their roundness. We can even see how one leg is in front of the other because of the drapery folds. There's also some modeling with light and shade. We can see it on the Virgin's face, neck, and hands, and also on the Christ child's face, hands, and feet. These gradations from light to dark give the figures a sense of volume and mass that makes them seem physical and real. Good, so all we need now is a conclusion. Why is all of this important? Why are all of these changes taking place? Let's put the picture in context. Sally Student says, well, it seems to me like religious paintings are getting more realistic so people can relate to them on a more personal level. Good, make that your conclusion. And so let's go back, and here we can start our conclusion. The National Gallery's enthroned Madonna and Child exemplifies the changes that were taking place in religious painting in Italy in the 1300s. During this period, Italian artists began to reject the flat, linear style of Byzantine icons and pioneered a more naturalistic style, employing techniques such as modeling with light and shade to make their religious subjects come to life. By humanizing their subjects in this way, Italian artists brought religion out into the real world so that people could see and touch and feel and thus relate to Jesus, Mary, and the saints on a more personal level. Now start writing your own analysis. Thanks for listening.